Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe and like my channel.
The Curse of Yig by Zelia Brown Reed. In 1925, I went into Oklahoma looking for snake lore, and I came out with a fear of snakes that will last me the rest of my life. I admit it is foolish, since there are natural explanations for everything I saw and heard, but it masters me nonetheless. If the old story had been all there was to it, I would not have been so badly shaken. My work as an American Indian ethnologist has hardened me to all kinds of extravagant legendary, and I know that simple white people can beat the Redskins at their own game when it comes to fanciful inventions. But I can't forget what I saw with my own eyes at the insane asylum in Guthrie. I called it the asylum because a few of the oldest settlers told me I would find something important there. Neither Indians nor white men would discuss the snake god legends I had come to trace. The oil boom newcomers, of course, knew nothing of such matters, and the red men and old pioneers were plainly frightened when I spoke to them. Not more than 6 or 7 people mentioned the asylum, and those who did were careful to talk in whispers. But the whisperers said that Dr. McNeil could show me a very terrible relic and tell me all I wanted to know. He could explain why Yig, the half-human father of serpents, is a shunned and feared object in central Oklahoma, and why old settlers shiver at the secret Indian orgies which make the autumn days and nights hideous with the ceaseless beating of tom-toms in lonely places. It was with the scent of a hound on the trail that I went to Guthrie, for I had spent many years collecting data on the evolution of serpent worship among the Indians. I had always felt from well-defined undertones of legend and archaeology that great Quetzalcoatl, benign snake god of the Mexicans, had an older and darker prototype. And during recent months, I had well-nigh proved it in a series of researches stretching from Guatemala to the Oklahoma plains. But everything was tantalizing and incomplete, for above the border, the cult of the snake was hedged about by fear and furtiveness. Now it appeared that a new and copious source of data was about to dawn, and I sought the head of the asylum with an eagerness I did not try to cloak. Dr. McNeil was a small, clean-shaven man of somewhat advanced years, and I saw at once from his speech and manner that he was a scholar of no mean attainments in many branches outside his profession. Grave and doubtful when I first made known my errand, his face grew thoughtful as he carefully scanned my credentials and the letter of introduction which a kindly old ex-Indian agent had given me. "So you have been studying the Yig legend, eh?" he reflected sententiously. "I know that many of our Oklahoma ethnologists have tried to connect it with Quetzalcoatl, but I don't think any of them have traced the intermediate steps so well. You have done remarkable work for a man as young as you seem to be, and you certainly deserve all the data we can give. I don't suppose old Major Moore or any of the others told you what it is I have here?" "They don't like to talk about it, and neither do I. It is very tragic and very horrible, but that's all. I refuse to consider it anything supernatural. There's a story about it that I'll tell you after you see it. A devilish sad story, but one that I won't call magic. It merely shows the potency that belief has over some people. I'll admit there are times when I feel a shiver that's more than physical, but in daylight I set all that down to nerves. I'm not a young fellow anymore, alas. To come to the point, the thing I have is what you might call a victim of Yig's curse, a physically living victim. We don't let the bulk of the nurses see it, although most of them know it is here. There are just 2 steady old chaps whom I let feed it and clean out its quarters. Used to be 3, but good old Stevens passed on a few years ago. I suppose he'll have to break in a new group pretty soon, for the thing doesn't seem to age or change much, and we old boys can't last forever. Maybe the ethics of the near future will let us give it a merciful release, but it's hard to tell. Did you see that single ground glass basement window over in the east wing when you came up the drive? That's where it is. I'll take you there myself. You needn't make any comment. Just look through the movable panel in the door, and thank God the light isn't any stronger. Then I'll tell you the story, or as much as I've been able to piece together." We walked downstairs very quietly and did not talk as we threaded the corridors of the seemingly deserted basement. Dr. McNeil unlocked the grey painted steel door, but it was only a bulkhead leading to a further stretch of hallway. At length he paused before a door marked B116, opened a small observation panel which he could use only by standing on tiptoe, and pounded several times upon the painted metal as if to arouse the occupant, whatever it might be. A faint stench came from the aperture as the doctor unclosed it, and I fancied his pounding elicited a kind of low hissing response. Finally he motioned me to replace him at the peephole, and I did so with a costless and increasing tremor. The barred ground-glass window close to the earth outside admitted only a feeble and uncertain pallor, and I had to look into the malodorous den for several seconds before I could see what was crawling and wriggling about on the straw-covered floor, emitting every now and then a weak and vacuous hiss. Then the shadowed outlines began to take shape, and I perceived that the squirming entity bore some remote resemblance to a human form laid flat on its belly. I clutched at the door handle for support as I tried to keep from fainting. The moving object was almost of human size and entirely devoid of clothing. It was absolutely hairless, and its tawny-looking back seemed subtly squamous in the dim, ghoulish light. Around the shoulders it was rather speckled and brownish, and the head was very curiously flat. As it looked up to hiss at me, I saw that the beady little black eyes were damnably anthropoid, but I could not bear to study them long. They fastened themselves on me with a horrible persistence, so that I closed the panel gaspingly and left the creature to wriggle about unseen in its matted straw and spectral twilight. I must have reeled a bit, for I saw that the doctor was gently holding my arm as he guided me away. I was stuttering over and over again, But for God's sake, what is it?" Dr. McNeil told me the story in his private office as he sprawled opposite him in an easy chair. The gold and crimson of late afternoon changed to the violet of early dusk, but still I sat awed and motionless. I resented every ring of the telephone and every whir of the buzzer, and I could have cursed the nurses and interns whose knocks now and then summoned the doctor briefly to the outer office. Night came, and I was glad my house switched on all the lights. Scientist though I was, my zeal for research was half forgotten amid such breathless ecstasies of fright as a small boy might feel when whispered witch tales go the rounds of the chimney corner. It seems that Yig, the snake god of the Central Plains tribes, presumably the primal source of the more southerly Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, was an odd, half-anthropomorphic devil of highly arbitrary and capricious nature. He was not wholly evil, and was usually quite well disposed toward those who gave proper respect to him and his children, the serpents. But in the autumn he became abnormally ravenous, and had to be driven away by means of suitable rites. This was why the tom-toms in the Pawnee, Wichita, and Caddo country pounded ceaselessly week in and week out in August, September, and October, and why the medicine men made strange noises with rattles and whistles curiously like those of the Aztecs and Mayas. Yig's chief trait was a relentless devotion to his children, a devotion so great that the redskins almost feared to protect themselves from the venomous rattlesnakes which thronged the region. Frightful clandestine tales hinted of his vengeance upon mortals who flouted him or wreaked harm upon his wriggling progeny, his chosen method being to turn his victim, after suitable tortures, to a spotted snake. In the old days of the Indian Territory, the doctor went on, there was not quite so much secrecy about Yig. The plains tribes, less cautious than the desert nomads and pueblos, talked quite freely of the legends and autumn ceremonies with the first Indian agents, and let considerable of the lore spread out through the neighboring regions of white settlement. The great fear came in the land rush days of '89, when some extraordinary incidents had been rumored, and the rumors sustained by what seemed to be hideously tangible proofs. Indians said that the new white men did not know how to get on with Yig, and afterward the settlers came to take the theory at face value. Now no old-timer in middle Oklahoma, white or red, could be induced to breathe a word about the snake god, except in vague hints. Yet, after all, the doctor added with the most needless emphasis, the only truly authenticated horror had been a thing of pitiful tragedy rather than of bewitchment. It was all very material and cruel, even that last phase which had caused so much dispute. Dr. McNeil paused and cleared his throat before getting down to his special story, and I felt a tingling sensation as when a theater curtain rises. The thing had begun when Walker Davis and his wife Audrey left Arkansas to settle in the newly opened public lands in the spring of 1889, and the end had come in the country of the Wichitas, north of the Washita River, in what is at present Caddo County. There is a small village called Binga there now, and the railway goes through, but otherwise the place is less changed than other parts of Oklahoma. It is still a section of farms and ranches, quite productive in these days, since the great oil fields do not come very close. Walker and Audrey had come from Franklin County in the Ozarks with a canvas-topped wagon, 2 mules, an ancient and useless dog called Wolf, and all their household goods. They were typical hill folk, youngish and perhaps a little more ambitious than most, and looked forward to a life of better returns by the hard work than they had in Arkansas. Both were lean, raw-boned specimens, the man tall, sandy, and grey-eyed, and the woman short and rather dark, with the black straightness of her hair suggesting a slight Indian admixture. In general, there was very little of distinction about them, and but for one thing, their annals might not have differed from those of thousands of other pioneers who flocked into the new country at that time. That thing was Walker's almost epileptic fear of snakes, which some laid to prenatal causes, and some said came from a dark prophecy about his end, with which an old Indian squaw had tried to scare him when he was small. Whatever the cause, the effect was marked indeed, for despite his strong, gentle courage, the very mention of a snake would cause him to grow faint and pale, while the sight of even a tiny specimen would produce a shock sometimes bordering on a convulsion seizure. The Davises started out early in the year in the hope of being on their new land for the spring plowing. Travel was slow, for the roads were bad in Arkansas, while in the territory there were great stretches of rolling hills and red, sandy barrens without any roads whatever. As the terrain grew flatter, the change from the native mountains depressed them more, perhaps, than they realized. But they found the people at the Indian agencies very affable, while most of the settled Indians seemed friendly and civil. Now and then they encountered a fellow pioneer, with whom crude pleasantries and expressions of amiable rivalry were generally exchanged. Owing to the season, there were not many snakes in evidence, so Walker did not suffer from a special temperamental weakness. In the earlier stages of the journey, too, there were no Indian snake legends to trouble him, for the transplanted tribes from the southeast do not share the wilder beliefs of their western neighbors. As fate would have it, it was a white man at Okmulgee in the Creek country who gave the Davises the first hint of the Yeek beliefs, a hint which had curiously fascinating effect on Walker, and caused him to ask questions very freely after that. Before long, Walker's fascination had developed into a bad case of fright. He took the most extraordinary precautions at each of the nightly camps, always clearing away whatever vegetation he found, and avoiding stony places wherever he could. Every clump of stunted bushes and every cleft in the great slab-like rocks seemed to him now to hide malevolent serpents, while every human figure, not obviously part of a settlement or emigrant train, seemed to him a potential snake god, till nearness had proved the contrary. Fortunately, no troublesome encounters came at this stage to shake his nerves still further. As they approached the Kickapoo country, they found it harder and harder to avoid camping near rocks. Finally, it was no longer possible, and poor Walker was reduced to the puerile expedient of droning some of the rustic anti-snake charms he had learned in his boyhood. 2 or 3 times the snake was really glimpsed, and these sights did not help the sufferer in his efforts to preserve composure. On the 22nd evening of the journey, a savage wind made it imperative, for the sake of the mules, to camp in as sheltered a spot as possible, and Audrey persuaded her husband to take advantage of a cliff which rose uncommonly high above the dried bed of a former tributary of the Canadian River. He did not like the rocky cast of the place, but allowed himself to be overruled this once, leading the animals sullenly toward the protecting slope, which the nature of the ground would not allow the wagon to approach. Audrey, examining the rocks near the wagon, meanwhile noticed a singular sniffing on the part of the feeble old dog. Seizing a rifle, she followed his lead, and presently thanked the stars that she had forestalled Walker in her discovery. For there, snugly nested in the gap between 2 boulders, was a sight it would have done him no good to see. Visible only as one convoluted expanse, but perhaps comprising as many as 3 or 4 separate units, was a mass of lacy wriggling which could not be other than a brood of newborn rattlesnake. Anxious to save Walker from a trying shock, Audrey did not hesitate to act, but took the gun firmly by the barrel and brought the butt down again and again upon the writhing objects. Her own sense of loathing was great, but it did not amount to a real fear. Finally she saw that her task was done, and turned to cleanse the improvised bludgeon in the red sand and dry, dead grass nearby. She must, she reflected, cover the nest up before Walker got back from tethering the mules. Old Wolf, tottering relic of mixed shepherd and coyote ancestry that he was, had vanished, and she feared he had gone to fetch his master. Footsteps at that instant proved a fear well-founded. A second more, and Walker had seen everything. Audrey made a move to catch him if he should faint, but he did no more than sway. Then the look of pure fright on his bloodless face turned slowly to something like mingled awe and anger, and he began to upbraid his wife in trembling tones. "God's sake, Aud, but why do you go for to do that? And you heard all the things they have been telling about the snake devil Yig? You'd ought to have told me, and we'd have moved on. Don't you know there's a devil god what gets even if you hurts his children? What for you do you think the Indians all dances and beats their drums in the fall about? This land's under a curse, I tell you. Nigh every soul we ever talked to since we came in said the same. Yig rules here, and he comes out every fall for to get his victims and turn 'em into snakes. Why, or they won't none of them Indians across the canyon kill a snake for love nor money. God knows what you have done to yourself, girl, a stomping out a whole brood of Yig's children. You'll get your sure, sooner or later, unless I can buy a charmer from some of the Indian medicine men. He'll get you. He'll get you, Aud, as sure there's a God in heaven. He'll come out of the night and turn you into a crawling spotted snake." All the rest of the journey Walker kept up the frightened reproofs and prophecies. They crossed the Canadian near Newcastle, and soon afterward met with the first of the real Plains Indians they had seen, a party of blanketed Wichitas, whose leader talked freely under the spell of the whiskey offered him, and taught poor Walker a long-winded protective charm against Yig in exchange for a quart bottle of the same inspiring fluid. By the end of the week, the chosen site in the Wichita country was reached, and the Davises made haste to trace their boundaries and perform the spring plowing before even beginning the construction of a cabin. The region was flat, drearily windy, and sparse of natural vegetation, but promised great fertility under cultivation. Occasional outcroppings of granite diversified a soil of decomposed red sandstone, and here and there a great flat rock would stretch along the surface of the ground like a man-made floor. There seemed to be very few snakes, or possible dens for them, so Audrey at last persuaded Walker to build the one-room cabin over a vast, smooth slab of exposed stone. With such a flooring, and with a good-sized fireplace, the wettest weather might be defied, though it soon became evident that dampness was no salient quality of the district. Logs were hauled in the wagon from the nearest belt of woods many miles toward the Wichita Mountains. Walker built his white-chimneyed cabin and crude barn with the aid of some of the other settlers, though the nearest one was over a mile away. In turn, he helped his helpers at similar house raisings, so that many ties of friendship sprang up between the new neighbors. There was no town worthy the name nearer than El Reno, on the railway 30 miles or more to the northeast. And before many weeks had passed, the people of the section had become very cohesive despite the wideness of the scattering. The Indians, a few of them had begun to settle down on ranches, were for the most part harmless, though somewhat quarrelsome when fired by the liquid stimulation which found its way to them despite all government bans. Of all the neighbors, the Davises found Joe and Sally Compton, who likewise hail from Arkansas, the most helpful and congenial. Sally is still alive, known now as Grandma Compton, and her son Clyde, then an infant in arms, has become one of the leading men of the state. Sally and Audrey used to visit each other often, for their cabins were only 2 miles apart, and in the long spring and summer afternoons they exchanged many a tale of old Arkansas and many a rumor about the new country. Sally was very sympathetic about Walker's weakness regarding snakes, but perhaps did more to aggravate than cure the parallel nervousness which Audrey was acquiring through his incessant praying and prophesying about the curse of Yig. She was uncommonly full of gruesome snake stories, and produced a direfully strong impression with her acknowledged masterpiece, the tale of a man in Scott County who had been bitten by a whole horde of rattlers at once and had swelled so monstrously from poison that his body had finally burst with a pop. Needless to say, Audrey did not repeat this anecdote to her husband, and she implored the Comptons to beware of starting it on the rounds of the countryside. It is to Joe's and Sally's credit that they heeded this plea with the utmost fidelity. Walker did his corn planting early, and in midsummer improved his time by harvesting a fair crop of the native grass of the region. With the help of Joe Compton, he dug a well which gave a moderate supply of very good water, though he planned to sink an artesian later on. He did not run into many serious snake scares, and made his land as inhospitable as possible for wriggling visitors. Every now and then he rode over to the cluster of thatched conical huts which formed the main village of the Wichitas and talked long with the old men and shamans about the snake god and how to nullify his wrath. Charms were always ready in exchange for whiskey, but much of the information he got was far from reassuring. Yig was a great god. He was bad medicine. He did not forget things. In the autumn, his children were hungry and wild, and Yig was hungry and wild too. All the tribes made medicine against Yig when the corn harvest came. They gave him some corn, and danced in proper regalia to the sound of whistle, rattle, and drum. They kept the drums pounding to drive Yig away and called down the aid of Tirava, whose children men are, even as the snakes are Yig's children. It was bad that the squaw of Davis killed the children of Yig. Let Davis say the charms many times when the corn harvest comes. Yig is Yig. Yig is a great god. By the time the corn harvest did come, Walker had succeeded in getting his wife into a deplorably jumpy state. His prayers and borrowed incantations came to be a nuisance, and when the autumn rites of the Indians began, there was always a distant wind-borne pounding of tom-toms to lend an added background of the sinister. It was maddening to have the muffled clatter always stealing over the wide red plains. Why would it never stop? Day and night, week on week, it was always going in exhaustless relays, as persistently as the red dusty winds that carried it. Audrey loathed it more than her husband did, for he saw in it a compensating element of protection. It was the sense of a mighty, intangible bulwark against evil that he got in his corn crop and prepared cabin and stable for the coming winter. The autumn was abnormally warm, and except for the primitive cookery, the Davises found scant use for the stone fireplace Walker had built with such care. Something in the unnaturalness of the hot dust clouds preyed on the nerves of all the settlers, but most of all on Audrey's and Walker's. The notions of a hovering snake curse and the weird, endless rhythm of the distant Indian drums formed a bad combination which any added element of the bizarre went far to render utterly unendurable. Notwithstanding this strain, several festive gatherings were held at one or another of the cabins after the crops were reaped, keeping naively alive in modernity those curious rites of the harvest home which are as old as human agriculture itself. Lafayette Smith, who came from southern Missouri and had a cabin about 3 miles east of Walker's, was a very passable fiddler, and his tunes did much to make the celebrants forget the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms. Then Halloween drew near, and the settlers planned another frolic, this time, had they but known it, of a lineage older than even agriculture. The dread witch sabbath of the primal pre-Aryans kept alive through ages in the midnight blackness of secret woods, and still hinting at vague terrors under its later-day mask of comedy and lightness. Halloween's was to fall on a Thursday, and the neighbors agreed to gather for their first revel at the Davis cabin. It was on that 31st of October that the warm spell broke. The morning was grey and leaden, and by noon the incessant winds had changed from searingness to rawness. People shivered all the more because they were not prepared for the chill, and Walker Davis's old dog, Wolf, dragged himself wearily indoors to a place beside the hearth. But the distant drums still thumped on, nor were the white citizenry less inclined to pursue their chosen rites. As early as 4 in the afternoon, the wagons began to arrive at Walker's cabin, and in the evening, after a memorable barbecue, Lafayette Smith's fiddle inspired a very fair-sized company to great feats of saltatory grotesqueness in the one good-sized but crowded room. The younger folk indulged in the amiable inanities proper to the season, and now and then old Wolf would howl with doleful and spine-tickling ominousness at some especial spectral strain from Lafayette's squeaky violin, a device he had never heard before. Mostly, though, the spattered veteran slept through the merriment, for he was past the age of active interests and lived largely in his dreams. Tom and Jeannie Rigby had brought their collie Zeke along, but the canines did not fraternize. Zeke seemed strangely uneasy over something, and nosed around curiously all the evening. Audrey and Walker made a fine couple on the floor, and Grandma Compton still likes to recall her impression of their dancing that night. Their worries seemed forgotten for the nuns, and Walker was shaved and trimmed into a surprising degree of spruceness. By 10 o'clock, all hands were healthy tired, and the guests began to depart family by family with many handshakings and bluff assurances of what a fine time everybody had had. Tom and Jenny thought Zeke's eerie howls as he followed them to the wagon were marks of regret at having to go home, though Audrey said it must be the faraway tom-toms which annoyed him, for the distant thumping was surely ghastly enough after the merriment within. The night was bitterly cold, and for the first time Walker put a great log in the fireplace and banked it with the ashes to keep it smouldering till morning. Old Wolf dragged himself within the ruddy glow and lapsed into his customary coma. Audrey and Walker, too tired to think of charms or curses, tumbled into the rough pine bed and were asleep before the cheap alarm clock on the mantel had ticked out 3 minutes. And from far away, the rhythmic pounding of those hellish tom-toms still pulsed on the chill night wind. Dr. McNeil paused here and removed his glasses, as if a blurring of the objective world might make the reminiscent vision clearer. "You will soon appreciate," he said, "that I had a great deal of difficulty in piecing out all that happened after the guests left. There were times, though, at first, when I was able to make a try at it." After a moment of silence, he went on with the tale. Audrey had terrible dreams of Yig, who appeared to her in the guise of Satan as depicted in cheap engravings she had seen. It was indeed from an absolute ecstasy of nightmare that she started suddenly awake to find Walker already conscious and sitting up in bed. He seemed to be listening intently to something, and silenced her with a whisper when she began to ask what had roused him. "Hark, Aud," he breathed. "Don't you hear something singing and buzzing and rustling? Do you reckon it's the fall crickets?" Certainly there was distinctly audible within the cabin such a sound as he had described. Audrey tried to analyze it, and was impressed with some element at once horrible and familiar which hovered just outside the rim of her memory. And beyond it all, waking a hideous thought, the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms came incessantly across the black plains on which a cloudy half-moon had set. "Walker, suppose it's the curse of Yig?" She could feel him tremble. "No, girl, I don't reckon he comes that way. He's shapen like a man, except you look at him close. That's what Chief Grey Eagle says. This here is some vomits coming out in the cold, not crickets I calculate, but somewhat like them. I ought to get up and stomp him out before makes much headway or get at the cabote." He rose, felt for the lantern that hung within easy reach, and rattled the tin matchbox nailed to the wall beside it. Audrey sat up in bed and watched the flare of the match grow into the steady glow of the lantern. Then, as their eyes began to take in the whole of the room, the crude rafters shook with the frenzy of their simultaneous shriek. For the flat, rocky floor, revealed in newborn illumination, was one seething, brown-speckled mass of wriggling rattlesnakes slithering toward the fire, and even now turning their loathsome heads to menace the fright-blasted lantern-bearer. It was only for an instant that Audrey saw the things. The reptiles were of every size, of unaccountable numbers, and apparently of several varieties, and even as she looked, 2 or 3 of them reared their heads as if to strike at Walker. She did not faint. It was Walker's crash to the floor that extinguished the lantern and plunged her into blackness. He had not screamed a second time. Fright had paralyzed him, and he fell as if shot by a silent arrow from no mortal's bow. To Audrey, the entire world seemed to whirl about fantastically, mingling with the nightmare from which she had started. Voluntary motion of any sort was impossible, for will and the sense of reality had left her. She fell back inertly on a pillow, hoping that she would wake soon. No actual sense of what had happened penetrated her mind for some time. Then, little by little, the suspicion that she was really awake began to dawn on her, and she was convulsed with a mounting blend of panic and grief which made her long to shriek out despite the inhibiting spell which kept her mute. Walker was gone, and she had not been able to help him. He had died of snakes, just as the old witch woman had predicted when he was a little boy. Poor Wolf had not been able to help either, probably had not even awaked from his senile stupor. And now the crawling things must be coming for her, writhing closer and closer every moment in the dark, perhaps even now twining slipperily about the bedpost and oozing up over the coarse woolen blankets. Unconsciously, she crept under the clothes and trembled. It must be the curse of Yig. He had sent his monster children on All Hallows Night, and they had taken Walker first. Why was that? Wasn't he innocent enough? Why not come straight for her? Hadn't she killed those little rattlers alone? Then she thought of the curse's form as told by the Indians. she wouldn't be killed, just turned on to a spotted snake. So she would be like those things she had glimpsed on the floor, those things which Yig had sent to get her and enroll her among their number. She tried to mumble a charm that Walker had taught her, but found she could not utter a single sound. The noisy ticking of the alarm clock sounded above the maddening beat of the distant tom-toms. The snakes were taking a long time. Did they mean to delay on purpose to play on her nerves? Every now and then, she thought she felt a stealthy, insidious pressure on the bedclothes, but each time it turned out to be only the automatic twitchings of her overwrought nerves. The clock ticked on in the dark, and a change came slowly over her thoughts. Those snakes couldn't have taken so long. They couldn't be Yig's messengers after all, but just natural rattlers that were nested below the rock and had been drawn there by the fire. They weren't coming for her, perhaps. Perhaps they had sated themselves on poor Walker. Where were they now? Gone? Coiled by the fire? Still crawling over the prone corpse of their victim? The clock ticked, and the distant drums throbbed on. At the thought of her husband's body lying there in the pitch blackness, a thrill of purely physical horror passed over Audrey. That story of Sally Compton's about the man back in Scott County. He too had been bitten by a whole bunch of rattlesnakes, and what had happened to him? The poison had rotted the flesh and swelled the whole corpse, and in the end the bloated thing had burst horribly with a detestable popping noise. Was that what was happening to Walker down there on the rock floor? Instinctively she felt that she had begun to listen for something too terrible even to name to herself. The clock ticked on, keeping a kind of mocking, sardonic time with the far-off drumming that the night wind brought. She wished it were a striking clock, so that she could know how long this eldritch vigil must last. She cursed the toughness of fibre that had kept her from fainting, and wondered what sort of relief the dawn could bring after all. Probably neighbors would pass. No doubt somebody would call. Would they find her still sane? Was she still sane now? Morbidly listening, Audrey all at once became aware of something which she had to verify with every effort of her will before she could believe it, and which, once verified, she did not know whether to welcome or dread. The distant beating of Indian tom-toms had ceased. They had always maddened her, but had not Walker regarded them as a bulwark against nameless evil from outside the universe? What were some of those things he had repeated to her in whispers after talking with Grey Eagle and the Wichita medicine men? She did not relish this new and sudden silence after all. There was something sinister about it. The loud ticking clock seemed abnormal in its new loneliness. Capable at last of conscious motion, she shook the covers from her face and looked into the darkness toward the window. It must have cleared after the moon set, for she saw the square picture distinctly against a background of stars. Then, without warning, came that shocking, unutterable sound. Ha! The dull, putrid pop of cleft skin and escaping poison in the dark. God! Sally's story, that obscene stench, and this gnawing, clawing silence. It was too much. The bonds of muteness snapped, and the black night waxed reverberant with Audrey's screams of stark, unbridled frenzy. Consciousness did not pass away with the shock. How merciful if only it had! Amidst the echoes of her shrieking, Audrey still saw the star-sprinkled square window ahead and heard the doom-boding ticking of that frightful clock. Did she hear another sound? Was that square window still a perfect square? She was in no condition to weigh the evidence of her senses or distinguish between fact and hallucination. No, that window was not a perfect square. Something had encroached on the lower edge. Nor was the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. There was, beyond dispute, a heavy breathing neither her own nor poor Wolf's. Wolf slept very silently, and his wakeful wheezing was unmistakable. Then Audrey saw against the stars the black, demoniac silhouette of something anthropoid, and the undulant bulk of a gigantic head and shoulders fumbling slowly toward her. Yeah, go away, go away. Go away, snake devil. Go away, Yig. I didn't want to kill them. I was feared he'd be scared of them. Don't, Yig, don't. I didn't go for to hurt your children. Don't come near me. Don't change me into no spotted snake. but the half-formless head and shoulders only lurched onward toward the bed very silently. Everything snapped at once inside Audrey's head, and in a second she had turned from a cowering child to a raging mad woman. She knew where the axe was, hung against the wall on those pegs near the lantern. It was within easy reach, and she could find it in the dark. Before she was conscious of anything further, it was in her hands, and she was creeping toward the foot of the bed, toward the monstrous head and shoulders that every moment groped their way nearer. Had there been any light, the look on her face would not have been pleasant to see. "Take that, you, and that, and that, and that." She was laughing shrilly now, and her cackles mounted higher as she saw that the starlight beyond the window was yielding to the dim, prophetic pallor of coming dawn. Dr. McNeil wiped the perspiration from his forehead and put on his glasses again. I waited for him to resume, and as he kept silent, I spoke softly. "She lived? She was found? Was it ever explained?" The doctor cleared his throat. "Yes, she lived in a way, and it was explained. I told you there was no bewitchment, only cruel, pitiful, material horror. It was Sally Compton who had made the discovery. She had ridden over to the Davis cabin the next afternoon to talk over the party with Audrey and had seen no smoke from the chimney. That was queer. It had turned very warm again, yet Audrey was usually cooking something at that hour. The mules were making hungry-sounding noises in the barn, and there was no sign of old Wolf sunning himself in the accustomed spot by the door. Altogether, Sally did not like the look of the place. She was very timid and hesitant as she dismounted and knocked. She got no answer, but waited some time before trying the crude door of split locks. The lock, it appeared, was unfastened, and she slowly pushed her way in. Then, perceiving what was there, she reeled back, gasped, and clung to the jamb to preserve her balance. A terrible odor had welled out as she opened the door, but that was not what had stunned her. It was what she had seen. For within that shadowy cabin, monstrous things had happened, and 3 shocking objects remained on the floor to awe and baffle the beholder. Near the burned-out fireplace was the great dog, purple decay on the skin left bare by mange and old age, and the whole carcass burst by the puffing effect of rattlesnake poison. It must have been bitten by a veritable legion of the reptiles. To the right of the door was the axe-hacked remnant of what had been a man, clad in a nightshirt and with the shattered bulk of a lantern clenched in one hand. He was totally free from any sign of snakebite. Near him lay the ensanguined axe, carelessly discarded, and wriggling flat on the floor was a loathsome, vacant-eyed thing that had been a woman, but was now only a mute, mad caricature. All that this thing could do was to hiss and hiss and hiss. Both the doctor and I were brushing cold drops from our foreheads by this time. He poured something from a flask on his desk, took a nip, and handed another glass to me. I could only suggest tremulously and stupidly, "So Walker had only fainted that first time? The screams roused him, and Axe did the rest?" "Yes." Dr. McNeil's voice was low, but he met his death from snakes just the same. It was his fear working in 2 ways. It made him faint, and it made him fill his wife with the wild stories that caused her to strike out when she thought she saw the snake devil. I thought for a moment. And Audrey, wasn't it queer how the curse of Yig seemed to work itself out on her? I suppose the impression of hissing snakes had been fairly ground into her. Yes, there was lucid spells at first, but they got to be fewer and fewer. Her hair came white at the roots as it grew, and later began to fall out. The skin grew blotchy, and when she died, I interrupted with a start. "Then, what was that thing downstairs?" McNeil spoke gravely. "That is what was born to her 3/4 of a year afterward. There were 3 more of them. 2 were even worse, but this one is the only one that lived."
The Lost Race by Robert E. Howard. Colrook glanced about him and hastened his pace. He was no coward, but he did not like this place. Tall trees rose all about, their sullen branches shutting out the sunlight. The dim trail led in and out among them, sometimes skirting the edge of a ravine, where Kororook could graze down at the treetops beneath. Occasionally, through a rift in the forest, he could see a way to the forbidding hills that hinted of the ranges, much farther to the west, that were the mountains of Cornwall. In those mountains, the bandit chief, Baruch the Cruel, was supposed to lurk, to descend upon such victims as might pass that way. Kororook shifted his grip on his spear and quickened his step. His haste was due not only to the menace of the outlaws, but also to the fact that he wished once more to be in his native land. He had been on a secret mission to the wild Cornish tribesmen, and though he had been more or less successful, he was impatient to be out of their inhospitable country. It had been a long, wearisome trip, and he still had nearly the whole of Britain to traverse. He threw a glance of aversion about him. He longed for the pleasant woodlands, the scampering deer and chirping birds to which he was used. He longed for the tall, white cliff where the blue sea lapped merrily. The forest through which he was passing seemed uninhabited. There were no birds, no animals, nor had he seen a sign of a human habitation. His comrades still lingered in the savage court of the Cornish king, enjoying his crude hospitality in no hurry to be away. But Kororook was not content, so he had left them to follow at their leisure, and had set out alone. Rather a fine figure of a man, Kororook. Some 6 feet in height, strongly though leanly built, he was with gray eyes, a pure Briton, but not pure Celt, his long yellow hair revealing in him all his race a trace of Belgae. He was clad in skillfully dressed deerskin, for the Celts had not yet perfected the coarse cloth which they had made the most of the race preferred the hides of deer. He was armed with a long bow of yew wood, made with no skill but with efficient weapon, a long bronze broadsword with a buckskin sheath, a long bronze dagger, and a small round shield rimmed with a band of bronze and covered with tough buffalo hide. A crude bronze helmet was on his head. Faint devices were painted on woad in his arms and cheeks. His beardless face was of the highest type of Briton, clear, straightforward, the shrewd, practical determination of the Nordic mingling with the reckless courage and dreamy artistry of the Celt. So Kororook strode the forest path warily, ready to flee or fight, but preferring to do neither just then. The trail led away from the ravine, disappearing around a great tree, and from the other side of the tree, Kororook heard sounds of conflict. Gliding warily forward and wondering whether he should see some of the elves and dwarves that were reputed to haunt these woodlands, he peered around the great tree. A few feet from him he saw a strange tableau. Backed against another tree stood a large wolf at bay, blood trickling from gashes about his shoulders, while before him, crouching for a spring, the warrior saw a great panther. Kororook wondered at the cause of the battle. Not often the lords of the forest met in warfare, and he was puzzled by the gnarls of the great cat. Savage, bloodlusting, yet they held a strange note of fear, and the beast seemed hesitant to spring in. Just why Kororook chose to take the part of the wolf, he himself could not have said. Doubtless it was just the reckless chivalry of the Celt in him, and admiration for the dauntless attitude of the wolf against his far more powerful foe. Be that as it may, Kororook, characteristically forgetting his bow and taking the more reckless course, drew his sword and leaped in front of the panther. But he had no chance to use it. The panther, whose nerve appeared to be already somewhat shaken, uttered a startled screech and disappeared among the trees so quickly that Kororook wondered if he had really seen a panther. He turned to the wolf, wondering if it would leap upon him. It was watching him, half crouching. Slowly it stepped away from the tree, and still watching him, backed away a few yards, then turned and made off with a strange, shambling gait. As the warrior watched it vanish into the forest, an uncanny feeling came over him. He had seen many wolves. He had hunted them and had been hunted by them, but he had never seen such a wolf before. He hesitated and walked warily after the wolf, following the tracks that were plainly defined in the soft loam. He did not hasten, being merely content to follow the tracks. After a short distance he stopped short, the hairs on his neck seeming to bristle. Only the tracks of the hind feet showed. The wolf was walking erect. He glanced about him. There was no sound. The forest was silent. He felt an impulse to turn and put as much territory behind him and the mystery as possible. But his Celtic curiosity would not allow it. He followed the trail, and it ceased altogether. Beneath a great tree the tracks vanished. Kororook felt the cold sweat on his forehead. What kind of place was this forest? Was he being led astray and eluded by some inhuman supernatural monster of the woodlands who sought to ensnare him? And Kororook backed away, his sword lifted, his courage not allowing him to run, but greatly desiring to do so. And so he came again to the tree where he had first seen the wolf. The trail had followed, led away from it and in another direction, and Kororook took it up, almost running in his haste to get out of the vicinity of the wolf, who walked on two legs and then vanished in the air. The trail wound about more tediously than ever, appearing and disappearing within a few dozen feet. But it was well for Kororook that it did, for thus he heard the voices of the men coming up the path before he saw them. He took to a tall tree that branched over the trail, lying close to the great bole along a wide-flung branch. 3 men were coming down the forest path. One was a big, burly fellow, vastly over 6 feet in height, with a long red beard and a great mop of red hair. In contrast, his eyes were a beady black. He was dressed in deerskins and armed with a greatsword. One of the 2 others was a lanky, villainous-looking scoundrel with only one eye, and the other was a small, wizened man who squinted hideously with both beady eyes. Kororook knew them by descriptions the Cornishmen had made between curses, and it was in his excitement to get a better view of the most villainous murderer in Britain that he slipped from the tree branch and plunged to the ground directly between them. He was up on the instant, his sword out. He could expect no mercy, for he knew that the red-haired man was Baruch, the cruel, the scourge of Cornwall. The bandit chief bellowed a foul curse and whipped out his greatsword. He avoided the Briton's furious thrust by a swift backward leap, and then the battle was on. Baruch rushed the warrior from the front, striving to beat him down by sheer weight, while the lanky one-eyed villain slipped around, trying to get behind him. The smaller man had retreated to the edge of the forest. The fine art of the fence was unknown to those early swordsmen. It was hack, slash, stab, the full weight of the arm behind each blow. The terrific blows crashed on his shield, beat Kororook to the ground, and the lanky one-eyed villain rushed in to finish him. Kororook spun about without rising, cut the bandit's legs from under him and stabbed him as he fell, then threw himself to one side and to his feet in time to avoid Baruch's sword, again driving his shield up to catch the bandit's sword in midair. He deflected it and whirled his own with all his power. Baruch's head flew from his shoulders. Then Kororook, turning, saw the wizened bandit scurry into the forest. He scurried after him, but the fellow had disappeared among the trees. Knowing the uselessness of attempting to pursue him, Kororook turned and raced down the trail. He did not know if there were more bandits in that direction, but he did know that if he expected to get out of the forest at all, he would have to do it swiftly. Without doubt, the villain who had escaped would have all the other bandits out, and soon they would be beating the woodlands for him. After running for some distance down the path and seeing no sign of any enemy, he stopped and climbed into the utmost branches of a tall tree that towered above its fellows. On all sides he seemed surrounded by a leafy ocean. To the west he could see the hills he had avoided. To the north, far in the distance, other hills rose. To the south, the forest ran an unbroken sea. But to the east, far away, he could barely see the line that marked the thinning out of the forest into the fertile plains. Miles and miles away, he knew not how many, but meant more pleasant travel, villages of men, people of his own race. He was surprised that he was able to see that far, but the tree in which he stood was a giant of its kind. Before he started to descend, he glanced about nearer at hand. He could trace the faintly marked lines of the trail lie now following, running away into the east, and could make out other trails leading into it, or away from it. Then a glint caught his eye. He fixed his gaze on a glade some distance down the trail, and saw presently a party of men enter and vanish. Here and there on every trail he caught glances of the glint of accoutrements, the waving of foliage, so the squinting villain had already roused the bandits. They were all around him. He was virtually surrounded. A faintly heard burst of savage yells from back up the trail startled him, so they had already thrown a cordon around the place of his flight and had found him gone. He had not fled swiftly. He would have been caught. He was outside the cordon, but the bandits were all about him. Swiftly he slipped from the tree and glided into the forest. Then began the most exciting hunt Kororook had ever engaged in, for he was the hunted and men were the hunters. Gliding and slipping from bush to bush and from tree to tree, now running swiftly, now crouching in a covert, Kororook fled ever eastward, not daring to turn back lest he be driven further back into the forest. At times he was forced to turn his course. In fact, he very seldom fled in a straight course, yet always he managed to work further eastward. Sometimes he crouched in bushes, or lay among some leafy branch, and saw bandits pass so close to him that they could have touched him. Once or twice they sighted him, and he fled, bounding over logs and bushes, darting in and out among the trees, and always he eluded them. It was one of those headlong flights that he noticed he had entered a small defile of small bills, of which he had been unaware, and looking back over his shoulder, he saw that his pursuers had halted, within full sight. Without pausing to ruminate on so strange a thing, he darted about a great boulder, felt a vine or something catch his foot, and was thrown headlong. Simultaneously, something struck the youth's head, knocking him senseless. When Kororuk recovered his senses, he found that he was bound hand and foot. He was being borne along over rough ground. He looked about him. Men carried him on their shoulders, but such men he had never seen before. Scarce above 4 feet stood the tallest, and they were small of build and very dark of complexion. Their eyes were black, and most of them stooped forward as if from a lifetime spent crouching and hiding. Peering furtively on all sides, they were armed with small bows, arrows, and spears, daggers, all pointed, not with crudely worked bronze, but with flint and obsidian. Of the finest workmanship, they were dressed in fine hides of rabbits and other small animals and a kind of coarse cloth. And many were tattooed from head to foot in ochre and woad. There were perhaps 20 in all. What sort of men were they? Kororuk had never seen the like. They were going down a ravine, on both sides which steep cliffs rose. Presently they seemed to come to a blank wall, where the ravine appeared to come to an abrupt stop. Here, at a word from one who seemed to be in command, they set the Briton down, and seizing hold of a large boulder, drew it to one side. A small cavern was exposed, seeming to vanish away into the earth. Then the strange men picked up the Briton and moved forward. Kororuk's hair bristled at the thought of being borne into that forbidding-looking cave. What manner of men were they? In all Britain and Alba, in Cornwall or Ireland, Kororuk had never seen such men, small dwarfish men, who dwelt in the earth. Cold sweat broke out on the youth's forehead. Surely they were the malevolent dwarves of whom the Cornish people had spoken, who dwelled in their caverns by day, and by night sallied forth to steal and burn dwellings, even slaying if the opportunity arose. You will hear of them even today if you journey to Cornwall. The men or elves that such wore bore him into the cavern, others entering and drawing the boulder back into place. For a moment all was darkness, and then torches began to glow, a way off, and at a shout they moved on. Other men of the caves came forward with the torches. Kororuk looked about him. The torches shed a vague glow over the scene. Sometimes one, sometimes another wall of the cave showed for an instant, and the Briton was vaguely aware that they were covered with paintings, crudely done, yet with a certain skill of his own race could not equal. But always the roof remained unseen. Kororuk knew that the seemingly small cavern had merged into a cave of surprising size. Though the vague light of the torches, the strange people moved, came and went, silently like shadows of the dim past. He felt the cords or thongs that bound his feet loosen. He was lifted upright. "Walk straight ahead," said a voice, speaking the language of his own race, and he felt a spear point touch the back of his neck. And straight ahead he walked, feeling his sandals scrape on the stone floor of the cave, until they came to a place where the floor tilted upward. The pitch was steep, and the stone was so slippery that Kororuk could not have climbed it alone. But his captors pushed him and pulled him, and he saw that long, strong vines were strung from somewhere at the top. Those the men seized, and bracing their feet against the slippery ascent, went up swiftly. Then their feet found level surface again. The cave made a turn, and Kororuk blundered out into a firelit scene that made him gasp. The cave debouched into a cavern so vast as to be almost incredible. The highly mighty walls swept up into a great arched roof that vanished into the darkness. A level floor lay between them, and though it flowed a river, an underground river, from under one wall it flowed to silently vanishing under the other. An arched stone bridge, seemingly of natural make, spanned the current. All around the walls of the great cavern, which was roughly circular, there were smaller caves, which before each glowed a fire. Higher up were other caves, regularly arranged tier on tier. Surely human men could not have built such a city. In and out among the caves, on the level floor of the main cavern, people were going about what seemed daily tasks. Men were talking together and mending weapons. Some were fishing from the river. Women were replenishing fires, preparing garments, and altogether it might have been just any other village in Britain to judge from their occupations. But it all struck Corrook as extremely unreal. The strange place, the small, silent people going about their tasks, the river flowing silently through it all. Then they came aware of the prisoner and flocked about him. There was none of the shouting, abuse, and indignities such as savages usually heap upon their captives. As the small men drew about Corrook, silently eyeing him with malevolent, wolfish stares, the warrior shuddered in spite of himself. But his captors pushed through the throng, driving the Briton before them. Close to the bank of the river, they stopped and drew away from around him. Two great fires leaped and flickered in front of him, and there was something between them. He focused his gaze and presently made out the object. A high stone seat like a throne, and in it seated an aged man with a long white beard, silent, motionless, but with black eyes that gleamed like a wolf's. The ancient was clothed in some sort of a single flowing garment. One claw-like hand rested on the seat near him, skinny, crooked fingers with talons like a hawk's. The other hand was hidden among his garments. The firelight danced and flickered. Now the old man stood out clearly, his hooked beak-like nose and long beard thrown into bold relief. Now he seemed to be recede until he was invisible to the gaze of the Briton, except for his glittering eyes. "Speak, Briton!" The words came suddenly, strong, clear, without a hint of age. "Speak what ye would say." Corrook, taken aback, stammered and said, Why, what manner of people are you? Why have you taken me prisoner? Are you elves?" "We are Pyats," said the stern reply. "Pyats!" Corrook had heard tales of those ancient people from the Gaelic Britons. Some said they were still lurking in the hills of Celeria. "But I have fought Pyats in Caledonia," the Briton protested. "They are short but massive and misshapen, not like you at all." "They are not true Pyats," came the stern retort. "Look about you, Briton," with the wave of an arm. "You see the remnants of a vanishing race, a race that once ruled Britain from sea to sea." The Briton stared, bewildered. "Hearken, Briton," the voice continued. "Hearken, barbarian, while I tell you the tale of a lost race." The firelight flickered and danced, throwing vague reflections on high, towering walls and on the rushing, silent current. The ancient's voice echoed through the mighty cavern. "Our people came from the south, over the islands, over the inland sea, over the snow-topped mountains, where some remained, to stay any enemies who might follow. Down into the fertile plains we came. Over all the land we spread. We became wealthy and prosperous. Then 2 kings arose in the land, and he who conquered drove out the conquered. So many of us made boats and set sail for the far-off cliffs that gleamed white in the sunlight. We found a fair land with fertile plains. We found a race of red-haired barbarians who dwelt in caves, mighty giants of great bodies and small minds. We built our huts of wattle. We tilled the soil. We cleared the forest. We drove the red-haired giants back into the forest. Further, we drove them back until at last they fled to the mountains of the west and the mountains of the north. We were rich. We were prosperous. Then," and his voice thrilled with rage and hate, until it seemed to reverberate through the cavern, "then the Celts came. From the isles of the west. In their rude coracles they came. In the west they landed, but they were not satisfied with the west. They marched eastward and seized the fertile plains. We fought. They were stronger. They were fierce fighters, and they were armed with weapons of bronze, whereas we had only weapons of flint. We were driven out. They enslaved us. They drove us into the forest. Some of us fled into the mountains of the west. Many fled into the mountains of the north. There they mingled with the red-haired giants we drove out so long ago, and became a race of monstrous dwarves, losing all the arts of peace and gaining only the ability to fight. But some of us swore that we would never leave the land we had fought for. But the Celts pressed us. There were many, and more came. So we took to caverns, to ravines, to caves. We, who had always dwelt in huts that let in much light, who had always tilled the soil, we learned to dwell like beasts in caves where no sunlight ever entered. Caves we found, of which this is the greatest. Caves we made. You, Britain, the voice came as a shriek and long arm was outstretched in accusation. You and your race. You have made a free, prosperous nation into a race of earth rats. We who never fled, who dwelt in the air and the sunlight close by the sea where traders came. We must flee like hunted beasts and burrow like moles. But at night, Ah, then for our vengeance. Then we slip from our hiding places, from our ravines and our caves, and torch daggers. Look, Britain. And following the gesture, Kororuk saw a rounded post of some kind, of very hard wood, set in a niche in the stone floor, close to the bank. The floor about the niche was charred as if by old fires. Kororuk stared, uncomprehending. Indeed, he understood little of what had passed. These people were even human. He was not at all certain. He had heard so much of them as little people. Tales of their doings, their hatred of the races of mankind, their maliciousness, flocked back to him. Yet he knew that he was gazing on one of the mysteries of the ages. That the tales which the ancient Gauls told of the Piets, already warped, would become even more warped from age to age, to result in tales of elves, dwarves, trolls, and fairies, at first accepted and then rejected entire by the race of man, just as the Neanderthal monsters resulted in tales of goblins and ogres. But of that Kororuk knew neither, nor cared, and the ancient was speaking again. There, there, Britain, exulted he, pointing to the post. There you shall pay, a scant payment for the debt your race owes mine, but to the fullest of your extent. The old man's exultation would have been fiendish, except for a certain high purpose in his face. He was sincere. He believed that he was only taking just vengeance, and he seemed like some great patriot for a mighty lost cause. But I am a Briton, stammered Kororuk. It was not my people that drove your race into exile. They were Gauls from Ireland. I am a Briton, and my race came from Gallia, only 100 years ago. We conquered the Gauls and drove them into Erin, Wales, and Caledonia, even as they drove your race. No matter, the ancient chief was on his feet. A Celt is a Celt, Briton or Gaul. It makes no difference. Had it not been Gaul, it would have been Britain. Every Celt who falls into our hands must pay, be it warrior or woman, babe or king. Seize him and bind him to the post. In an instant, Kororuk was bound to the post, and he saw with horror the Piets piling wood about his feet. When you are sufficiently burned, Britain, said the ancient, this dagger that has drunk the blood of 100 Britons shall quench its thirst in yours. But never have I harmed a Piet, Kororuk gasped, struggling with his bonds. You pay not for what you did, but for what your race has done, answered the ancient sternly. Well, do I remember the deeds of the Celts when they first landed in Britain? The shrieks of the slaughtered, the screams of ravished girls, and the smokes of burning villages, the plundering. Kororuk felt his short hairs bristle. Then the Celts landed on Britain. That was over 500 years ago. And his Celtic curiosity would not let him keep still, even at the stake with the Piets preparing to light firewood piled about him. You could not remember that. That was ages ago. The ancient looked at him somberly. And I am age old. In my youth I was a witch finder, and an old woman witch cursed me as she writhed at the stake. She said I should live until the last child of the Pictish race had passed, that I should see the once mighty nation go down into oblivion, and then, and only then, should I follow it, for she put upon me the curse of life everlasting. Then his voice rose until it filled the cavern. But the curse was nothing. Words can do no harm, can do nothing to a man. I live. 100 generations have I seen come and go, and yet another 100. What is time? The sun rises and sets, and another day was passed into oblivion. Men watch the sun and set their lives by it. They league themselves on every hand with time. They count the minutes that race them into eternity. Man outlived the centuries ere he began to reckon time. Time is man-made. Eternity is the work of the gods. In this cavern there is no such thing as time. There are no stars, no sun. Without its time, within its eternity, we count not time. Nothing marks the speeding of the hours. The youths go forth. They see the sun, the stars. They reckon time, and they pass. I was a young man when I entered this cavern, and I have never left it. As you reckon time, I may have dwelt here 1,000 years, or an hour. When not banded by time, the soul, the mind, call it what you will, call and conquer the body. And the wise men of the race in my youth knew more than the outer world will ever learn. When I feel that my body begins to weaken, I take the Magi draft. That is known only to me, of all the world. It does not give immortality. That is the work of the mind alone, but it rebuilds the body. The race of the Piets vanish. They fade like snow on the mountain, and when the last is gone, this dagger shall free me from the world. Then in a swift change of tone, "Light the faggots!" Kororuk's mind was fairly reeling. He did not in the least understand what he had just heard. He was positive that he was going mad, and what he had saw the next minute assured him of it. Through the throng came a wolf, and he knew what it was, the wolf whom he had rescued from the panther close by the ravine in the forest. Strange how long ago and far away that seemed. Yes, it was the same wolf, that same strange shambling gait. Then the thing stood erect and raised its front feet to its head. What nameless horror was that? Then the wolf's head fell back, disclosing the man's face, the face of a Piot, one of the first werewolves. The man stepped out of the wolfskin and strode forward, calling something. A Piot, just starting to light the wood about the Briton's feet, drew back the torch and hesitated. The wolf-picked stepped forward and began to speak to the chief, using Celtic, evidently for the prisoner's benefit. Kororuk was surprised to hear so many speak his language, not reflecting upon its comparative simplicity and the abilities of the Piots. "Who is this?" asked the Piot who had played wolf. "A man is to be burned and should not be?" "How?" exclaimed the old man fiercely, clutching his long beard. "Who are you to go against a custom of old age antiquity?" "I met a panther," answered the other, "and this Briton risked his life to save mine. Shall a Piot show ingratitude?" And as the ancient hesitated, evidently pulled away by his fanatical lust for revenge, and the other by his equally fierce racial pride, the Piot burst into a wild flight of oration, carried on in his own language. At last the ancient chief nodded. "A Piot ever paid his debts," said he with impressive grandeur. "Never a Piot forgets. Unbind him. No Celt shall ever say that a Piot showed ingratitude." Kororuk was released, and as like a man in a daze, he tried to stammer his thanks. The chief waved him aside. "A Piot never forgets a foe, ever remembers a friendly deed," he replied. "Come," murmured his Pictish friend, tugging at the Celt's arm. He led the way into a cave leading away from the main cavern. As they went, Kororuk looked back to see the ancient chief seated upon his stone throne, his eyes gleaming as he seemed to gaze back through the lost glories of the ages. On each hand the fires leaped and flickered, a figure of grandeur, the king of a lost race. And on Kororuk's guide led him, and at last they emerged, and the Briton saw the starlit sky above him. "In that way is the village of your tribesmen," said the Piot, pointing, "where you will find a welcome until you wish you had taken your journey anew." And he pressed gifts on the Celt, gifts of garments of cloth and finely worked deerskin, beaded belts, a fine horn bow with arrows skillfully tipped with obsidian, gifts of food. His own weapons were returned to him, but an instant, said the Briton as the Piot turned to go. "I followed your tracks in the forest. They vanished." There was a question in his voice. The Piot laughed softly. "I leaped into the branches of the tree. Had you looked up, you would have seen me. If ever you wish a friend, you will ever find one in Barua, chief among the Alban Piots." He turned and vanished, and Kororuk strode through the moonlit toward the Celtic village.